You're listening to Tune Dig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. We dig into an album to discover what makes it interesting, and then we dig into the crates for a vinyl copy to give away to one lucky winner.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.
Today we're talking about Kid A by Radiohead.
Normally we pick an album that at least one of us really loves, or something really similar, and the other, at the very least, respects a lot. Right?
Right.
This one, I would not say is like that.
This one is definitely in the middle of the room between us.
I got a lot of respect for this record. I don't know that I would say that I care about it a lot, but this was a really good exercise. And first of all, finding out that we have people that would actually like to hear us talk about a specific album, which was both humbling and confusing all at once.
Mostly the latter.
Right. And secondly, the idea that I would be putting off the vibes that say, I would love for that guy to talk to me about Radiohead for an hour makes me question my vibe as a whole. But I think there's a thread here that makes for some interesting discussion about Kid A specifically, because I think one of the reasons personally, and I'd love to hear what your experience has been, personally, one of the reasons I haven't loved Radiohead is kind of because of how many people love Radiohead.
Precisely. Yeah. I mean, at the risk of this whole thing turning into like a hipster farce, my whole thesis coming into this episode was like, yeah, this is a really good and interesting album. And I've come to like it a lot more than I ever thought I could personally like a Radiohead record. I've always been like, that's cool, but I would never go out of my way to experience it. Has just been kind of my general Radiohead approach. So it's a little bit of yes and, right? Like, yes, this is a really cool record, and I sort of feel like I get it now, but also everybody really just needs to calm down.
And the thing over the years, too, that's kept me respecting Radiohead, not that my opinion matters that much.
Nothing in the universe matters very much, Cliff.
Yeah, well, that's the end of the podcast, so see you all later.
Rick and Morty theme plays.
One of the things that's kept me in touch with Radiohead over the years that I have a lot of respect for sure, is the way that they've approached marketing, for lack of a better term, of their music. The way that at pretty much every possible turn, they've countered the popular idea of how you should sell music and has gone on to prove objectively that they don't need whatever the music industry thinks that they need to sell a bunch of records. And this is a great and classic example of maybe the first time that they really pushed into that in a new way and were objectively able to show that they have such a connection with their fan base, one, and two, such a connection with how people experience music that they're able to take a piece of music and, at the very least, like to posit, take a piece of music that's not necessarily incredibly organized or even very focused, and get it spread throughout an audience of people who really love and believe in them, to the point to where that audience is able to not only hear a new sound and appreciate it, but actually go so far as to think that they were maybe the first people to do it. And that always bothered me a little bit. But I think being able to go back and look at Kid A and pick it up from its cultural context and look at it in a couple of ways makes for a really helpful discussion now. One is, again, reapproaching the music itself. What did they actually do that was new and different at that time? And where were they getting inspired, and why did they do it? Because I think there's a caricature of a narrative about this album in general. But secondly, to go back and see how much they really did differently to get this album out and to create some buzz around it at a time where it was kind of unheard of, the tactics that they used to make it happen.
And I'll also say, just at a musical level, one of the things that I really appreciate about Radiohead, feel however I feel about the music itself, is the deliberate left turn on every album. And this was probably arguably still the hardest left turn of them all. And that probably says something about their audience as well, if they are deliberately trying to challenge and alienate them and the audience has followed them every step of the way. that probably says something about the kind of person who really, really likes Radiohead. Having said that, there's a little too much reading into stuff, to your point, kind of all over the critical consensus around this album. Now, 15 years on, it is, to your point, good to get into the cultural context because it was a total mess when this thing came out. And you're doing something if you get perfect 10s in one place and you get 1.5 out of 5 stars in a similar echelon of reviewing, and you do it right after your really, really big record that kind of cements you as being in the pantheon. So, there's a lot to dig into, but you said something about there being kind of a parody of a narrative, which I think Tom York would appreciate because he's pushed so hard against like all caps, greatest rock band of all time, trademark symbol type stuff, all the cliches about the narrative arc around musicians. So I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
In a way, I feel for Tom York because I think even in his desire to say, please leave me alone and let me just be a little bit sad, he even created a whole new narrative.
Also, sad doesn't really capture it.
That's fair.
Like, let's just go on record as saying, like, this dude has a multitude of feelings that get flattened into sad, which I think is one of the things that makes Kid A interesting, is that, like, I think so much about Bjork when I listen to Radiohead. Like, I just put them up as two of the, like, intentionally weirdest artists of the 90s that had huge commercial success. They get regarded similarly breathlessly. But Bjork talked about emotional landscapes with Homogenic, right? And I think a lot of the texturing that happens on this record feels a lot like that same idea. Certainly the way that they kind of threw the idea and purpose of lyrics out the window on this album reflect that. So to call it sad flattens it out a great deal, but that is kind of one of the words that, like, sad, paranoid, alienated, all that shit appears again and again in the articles about it. So I just want to push back on that for a minute. Let people contain multitudes.
Well, that's what's funny about it. Is like we can flatten him historically, and he got flattened at the time, and he was so upset about the idea that he was popular enough for his emotional landscape to get flattened to begin with, and then it itself became its own flattened, like, oh, he's angsty about how people are upset about him being sad. And he's like, just leave me alone,
It's like in The Other Guys when Mark Wahlberg gets really angry at the art exhibit and they're like critiquing it. They're like, oh, it's so brave.
I'll burn this bitch down to the ground. Oh, fresh, energetic.
Ooh, I love his rawness.
Stop critiquing me, okay? I'm a human being. I'm not a piece of art. Yes, bravo.
Audiences are the worst. If you're not making it, you are the worst.
I do want to say, I think at this point, Radiohead had earned what they got from their fan base in terms of the level of trust and commitment they got to be able to take this strong of a left turn. So Pablo Honey, the different things that came before this were great records in what Radiohead would consider themselves to be a rock format, to the point to where, within a few records, they're able to skyrocket to being the most well-known rock band, at least in Europe, if not, top 5 in the world at this point, right? And so they've reached this level of fame. And so I think the caricature of that story, right, the parody of it becomes Tom York is rejecting the fame that he gets from the simple rock format, and he's like bravely embracing this new direction, and he has a lot of conviction about it, and he goes into the studio and he takes that angst about being so popular in a simple format, and he turns around to the rest of the band and he says, let's change the face of rock music forever. And they all said, hell yeah, my man, but in a British accent.
Okay.
And they all smashed their guitars and then built keyboards from computers and then recorded Kid A.
Wow, so brave.
And like any myth, there are fragments of truth in it, but I think it's both worse and more simple than that in a couple of ways. And diving back into the history of it, I think helped me to see more about this record, understand more about it, and then I think position it more accurately in musical history in a way that is more fair. Because I do want to push back on the idea that Kid A changed music. Kid A took music that was already happening for the last 10 years prior to that and funneled it directly into the mainstream consciousness in a way that got past people's defenses to where they said, this is music that I like. And I didn't know that I liked it because I had never listened to Aphex Twin or Portishead or like pretty much anything else, I guess.
Boards of Canada.
But they do deserve, again, the credit of funneling so much of that into mainstream consciousness and having people pick it up to the point to where they are in love with it and saying that it's innovative and new and insane and something they'd never heard before.
And there's something to be said for being able to make ideas like that more palatable. And to your point about marketing, making it an idea that's digestible to people. Same thing happened with Nirvana a few years earlier, taking the ideas of the Melvins and Mudhoney and some of the farther out, like Jesus Lizard, all of these types of influences and making it Beatlesy. Like, there's a lot to be said for that. That's kind of its own gift. It's a little bit of a compulsion as well, but somebody's got to do it. And they were the ones to do it, you know, and it's interesting in its own right.
So I want to give credit there, but I also want to dive a little further into, I would never have expected to want to talk about this in an episode about Kid A, but I think it is helpful to talk about where Thom Yorke was coming from as an individual right then, because it helps lay a little bit of the groundwork of the story here in a way that I don't think always comes out really clearly, because he does say, and these are quotes from him, that at the time he had become, quote, a complete fucking mess and completely unhinged. Completely unhinged is a term that used to mean something different than just the politician of the day that we're talking about. So give that more weight than it has these days at all, because now we just call people unhinged whenever we don't think we agree with whatever they're saying.
Loud noises.
Are you just looking at things in the room and saying you hate them?
Yes. Yeah. The room is Twitter.
So he was definitely disillusioned with the rock format, and to his credit, seemed to be disillusioned with the rock format because he had used it for a few records and seems to feel like he got easily popular. And again, they deserve all the credit in the world for it. That part of the story is certainly true. But I think that it goes deeper than that, and really going back and listening, especially to some of his interviews, which to be quite honest are sometimes painful to hear him talk. They're very slow. But he gave one insight. There's a video called Reflections on Kid A that came out in 2001, and they're talking to Tom, and he talks kind of about how he's frustrated by the expectations of rock stardom, and that there are these expectations that come along with it. And we can all use our imagination, and thanks to, you know, The Who and Led Zeppelin and whatever else for kind of making this a palette that 20 years on or 20 or 30 years past that would become boring, I guess, to be expected to destroy a hotel room and, you know, I don't know, do cocaine off of a helicopter's blades while it's running.
But even the mechanical stuff, even the go in the studio, make a record, tour on it for a very long time. He was just like, there are so many baked in assumptions to the mythology of being in a band. So he had just gotten to the point where he hated all of the expectations, kind of at like the internal level, not even at the fan level, which I thought was really interesting. It was the mundane stuff that seemed to be getting him down the most.
I think that there are kind of two aspects of that story that are important to discuss. And I think one of them gets told in the mythology, and one of them doesn't really get discussed as much. And I think it gives us some insight into this record that helps anyone, whether you love it or not, see where it's coming from and what it's designed to do. The aspect I think we all hear about is, getting frustrated with the expectations of stardom results in, I don't want to, like you say, have to go and record the album and go through the steps and make music into a business that gets internalized that I have to go through the motions of because now I've achieved fame and it's all about sustaining it now. So I think that part's relatively clear. That's part of the story, and it's easy to write stories about that and tell that narrative. But there's something else that he mentions in Reflections on Kid A that kind of opened me up to a different angle. He mentions that essentially like the outcome of society putting these expectations on rock stars produces something that he doesn't want to see, something that he actually wants to change culturally, because beyond just the fact that what he really wants to do is focus on being on stage and in the moment, he also wants other people to be a part of that moment, and he thinks that these expectations get in the way. And the example that he gives to talk about this is that he talks about going into an art museum where there's a Rothko exhibit.
There's a Rothko room in the Tate in London, and when kids go in there, they sort of go, wow, this is great. And all they see is the joy of the colours in the paintings. And all the adults see is this poor sod who killed himself.
He's talking about how the adults only see the end. They only see Rothko committed suicide. Therefore, everything that's in the exhibit is art done by someone who killed themselves later on. And that this whole narrative arc ends in sadness and is a sad thing, that the art is sad and lamentable. And he talks about how the children who are in the family don't have to see things that way because they're able to just absorb the art as it comes to them when they see the ending be something sad that no one else wanted to see. It doesn't necessarily affect them the same way. And so they're able to go and still experience the art the way that it would have been experienced before the ending of Rothko's story had already been written. And that he wants people to be able to experience music, himself included, a lot more like the children who don't need to see the ending and don't need to let the sadness color the rest of the story. That being inside of the moment itself is the thing that's most important and leads to the connection to other human beings and to art.
That's like a Theodore Adorno level of purity about like only the now matters. Don't think about the context. Don't try to learn any of the case facts or anything. Just like take it at a pure vibrational level. That's something, man.
So whether or not that's how I would see things in that situation.
Yeah, it's very hard to do, right? It's almost like counter to human nature a little bit, but it's something to be achieved. It's like a meditation type of aspiration, I guess.
It's at least one reasonably valid aspect
Sure.
to view music from.
You can try.
Right. There were a couple of quotes that I think helped from around the time as well, because people were kind of trying to figure out what did this kind of pivot in Thom Yorke start to create culturally, and what was the difference between this and someone who just gets frustrated by fame and like revolts or becomes eccentric and drug-addled, basically. And a couple of them are helpful because they use the constant parallel that people were drawing at this time with Pink Floyd as a way to speak to this reaction and response. So, quote from the BBC article said, unlike Roger Waters' similar plight with stadium-filling Pink Floyd, Thom Yorke didn't get all messianic and self-pitying. He got angry and perverse, which is a much better solution, according to the BBC, which is the most BBC thing I've read today. But then another one that's really similar from Spin talks about there's this solemn self-seriousness. This self-seriousness is why the parallels with Pink Floyd get drawn so frequently. And I think that that's fair too, right? I love Pink Floyd. I'm not the biggest Pink Floyd fan in the world, but I do agree that like their whole take on it was like, we're never not going to be serious about what Pink Floyd means, whether that makes us a caricature of ourselves or not. This flying pig is for real.
Yeah.
Right?
Capitalized big ass art project.
Yeah, so similarly, whether it gets taken as a parody or not, bands like that are making serious artistic statements. And so the quote is, in a tyrannically trivial pop era, remember this came out in the year 2000, there's something faintly heroic about this impulse. Is there still a market for it? Go ask Trent Reznor. And like, it's kind of a weird thing to say now, but I think that helps me, again, draw the line with, sometimes I've always struggled with, what am I missing about Radiohead that makes people want to like give their lives to this band in a way that it's good, but what is that thing? Like, what am I missing about it? And I think even in going back and reading some more about the responses that were coming out at the time, it's helpful to see it as this record was experienced live primarily. And you'll be able to see as we kind of tell some of this story as well about how the music got spread. Like this music was being experienced before the album came out, was spread as an experience of live music. And the live tour for Kid A was supported by Sigur Rós, which is a band who said that they would never support another act and went back on that promise because they were asked to be on the Kid A tour. Which also a good time to point out. Somehow Radiohead gets credited with discovering Sigur Rós, and that is factually incorrect. But to go back to that quote, like thinking about Radiohead in the context of a live experience made me think of Nine Inch Nails, because that's another band that I don't really understand fully from a studio perspective.
Oh man,
but I really want to see them live.
Yeah,
and like
still one of the loudest bands I've ever seen live, for real.
It's a full immersion.
Yeah.
And so that connection made sense to me, like that self-serious, we are going to build this experience. You will not have another experience like this. And this is really the only way to hear this music, is a thread that helps communicate what Radiohead was trying to do over its entire career, but I think is what gave them the ability to say, we're going to literally stop recording with guitars for an entire record after being a guitar band and take this turn, and you're going to come with us because we know how to build a moment that you'll want to follow into.
And probably not to be underestimated, right there at the turn of the century was arguably like the peak of fan message boards for following live stuff. And there was a lot in the fan culture around, they debuted this song live, I hope it's on the new record. And this material that they recorded wound up being Kid A and Amnesiac. And so there were songs that didn't debut for another year until the next record. And they were like, where the hell's Pyramid Song? So yeah, it was really interesting some of the ways that it almost became like a marketing technique. Like that's how they built the hype. The opposite of the machine. They just kind of put it out into the ether and people sat with it and wanted to get the best possible version of it later. Because to my knowledge, they don't really put out, they have a live records, but they don't put out a ton of like bootleggy stuff. So interesting to me to think of them as a live band, you know, it's like anywhere near something like the Grateful Dead, where people are like, what was Radiohead like on 4/23/2000 or whatever?
The comparison to Grateful Dead kept coming up and made me really uncomfortable. So the way that they wound that up, though, is they hitched their wagon to early music sharing culture. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that they themselves were necessarily recording and distributing the bootlegs, but they were encouraging other people to record the live songs however they could. Remember, this was literally, 1999, 2000. So this is a real player type streaming era stuff. Like
128-bit MP3.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is like
dial
super
up
early
as
on.
hell.
Right. So this is not trivial to record something, upload it, and distribute it.
Right.
It takes literal time and energy. But they had early performances, bootlegs of those, uploaded to file sharing services. And so those started to get distributed before this record or Amnesiac had a name. Mm-hmm. So, right. So this is what was helping me understand it, right? Thinking of, okay, everything we've talked about so far, you've built up so much credibility with a huge audience over a few records. You've got them willing to hear whatever you're ready to put out. They're eager for it. You're writing this music that's really different, but you're starting to slowly mix it in to live performances. You're encouraging people to listen to it, get excited about it, and share it. And so that the energy, like, it's hard to describe. There are not many things that I would say that we have, better off than people who are younger than us when it comes to technology. But there was a thing in that early P2P sharing stuff where it's like every piece of music was really exciting, mm-hmm. but it also required literal time and energy. Like me and you specifically used to bring our hard drives to each other's places and trade music because it's really hard to go find the music, download it, make sure it's in a good enough quality, make sure all the tracks are actually correct. There was like real work that had to be put into the meta tags and album artwork and all this. But there was some energy behind it.
And that was like by the mid 2000s when we sort of solved it. Like the couple of years before that were even wilder than that, where to download a handful of songs, you like put them on download and you let them run overnight and you woke up and you had a CD's worth of stuff. And I know we sound like such Luddites even talking about that. And it's insane being in our early 30s having that kind of a conversation. But again, that's sort of precisely the thing that is like Radiohead source materials, like Radiohead fodder. Things have accelerated at a pace that make a normal amount of nostalgia or relationship with time seem kind of insane. Like they have always been acutely aware of this being a world that we've built that we were not prepared for and we don't understand, and have been also sort of the purveyors of it with some of the things that they did. Like they haven't been afraid of it. They haven't been Luddites. Again, similarly to Bjork, they have used it in some of the most interesting and utopian ways, but have been skeptical of it by the same token. Utopia and dystopia are just two sides of the same coin.
Just give me a generic topia. Thank you.
Just regular topia for me. Thanks.
Yeah, by no intentionality of our own, we've managed to cover Radiohead, Björk, and Prince, 3 artists who were absolutely at the top of using the internet to spread their music and connect with people in new formats, and who were unafraid to utilize those. So they had this credibility. They're allowing bootlegs to be passed around and pretty much actively encouraging it. And then, like, this is the really critical part of it. They push into it at a time where, like, it's important to remember we had not even at this point in history gotten to the point where the music industry as a whole was like, downloading is really ruining this for artists specifically, not us, artists. Downloading is bad for artists, right? And so, like, we hadn't even gotten to that point yet. This was so early on.
Yeah.
And so not only are they allowing live cuts to be passed around to create some energy, they leaked their own record on Napster 3 weeks before it was released. So now they're really and I mean, this is you can kickstart your own album and be an independent artist. Like, this is unheard of levels of ridiculous approaches to marketing. And it happens.
This is when CDs got to be like $16.99 or something absurd. This was the peak of the margin era.
Freaking Best Buy, $21.99 shit.
No, that was like Sam Goody or whatever the stores at the mall were. Yeah. When you actually went to the mall.
So they're leaking their stuff on Napster. They're doing a couple of other things that are just really on brand, especially for Tom York. No singles, no music videos, practically no interviews, practically no photo shoots. They're straight up like, we don't even want to do the basic baseline of marketing. Like, they were so done with the entirety of the format. Like, in that, I think that's where this story started to open up for me. It's not that any of that is just insane or that they were just oracles of what the future would look like, but there is this balance that was struck between technology that was changing, a willingness to embrace it to create experiences and community, but then also just the fact that being that on brand about I really don't care about anything happened to just really work for the vibe of this record and this band at that particular time, so that they were able to not only prove downloading isn't going to hurt our record sales because it went platinum the first week in Britain, but they proved it by also saying we're going to create a marketing vacuum and we're still going to go platinum in the first week. And that's a story that no one else can tell, especially from this time period. And it goes all the way into the details. And so I've got a lot of respect for the completeness of vision here, not only in being willing to let fans get a hold of the music, not only in refusing to do the marketing, but a couple of smaller details too. One of which is they had MTV2, K-Rock, and some other radio stations only playing the album in its entirety. I mean, that's stuff that we hadn't heard since AM radio in the 60s, and bands like Led Zeppelin asking to have entire records play and have that be the expectation, right? This is clearly not that point. This is boy band era, right? And so forcing people to do it to the point to where, I'm going to say allegedly, because I only saw this in one place, but it's good enough to include, they didn't even give the record label executives the ability to listen to selections from the record. They put them on a bus from Hollywood to Malibu and played the entire album at once, making sure that they had a long enough drive to cover the whole thing so that they could only hear it all at one time.
And there could not have been scenery less appropriate than the drive from Hollywood to Malibu.
Doesn't California make you sad?
72 and existential.
And just to round it out, because it was also pretty incredible at the time, they did manage to get some support from Capitol Records. So Robin Bechtel was the head of new media at Capitol Records and was a really early believer in what the internet could do. And so Robin was a great pairing for what Radiohead wanted to do at this point. Bechtel said everything in the industry at that point was like, the internet is not important. It's not selling records. So again, it's the internet had not yet become the enemy. The internet was irrelevant to the old farts running the record company, who are still probably running the record companies. And Robin said everything for them had to translate to a sale, right? And I knew that the internet was going to be able to generate sales, but I couldn't prove it because every record had MTV and had radio with it. And one, that's true from a pattern perspective. All the other music had, that sort of marketing and that template. But secondly, it's important to remember, like, literally the ability to track things like that was not pervasive on the internet either. No one was asking anyone to prove the value of marketing on the internet because of how much they didn't believe it was possible. And so just to round out this whole, like, how did they make Kid A such a thing? There was this thing called iBlip, which was a Java applet, which is some dork shit, which is which was the way that you could embed stuff on websites. So like well before there were little widgets that we could grab from Spotify, this was the equivalent of that. So in Radiohead fan sites, so in your GeoCities, Tom York is my bestie.geocities.netbiz or whatever, you could embed this thing.
Anyone under 20 is going to listen to this episode and be like, what are these guys talking about? Everything feels like we're talking about Laserdisc, like a thing that just came and went and barely existed. You still have Radiohead. And from the ashes of all this rubble, you still have Radiohead.
Laser discs, young people, were CDs that were the size of records. So that Java applet gets embedded on fan sites, not only allows people to pre-order the album, which, okay, fine, but you can actually stream it. So not only could you go and download it if you were savvy enough at that time to use your parents' computer and download a bunch of garbage to it and give them a virus, but you could just straight up stream it, which was another thing that was not happening. But they were able to start tracking it to the point to where they saw this is being embedded on over 1,000 sites and streamed almost 500,000 times, which is huge for that point, right? So, like, to me, going back and looking at, especially now with the benefit of 20 years out, technologically speaking, where we take so much of this for granted, going back and saying, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying the music was bad and they were able to get past the music being bad by decent marketing and forethought, but I do want to say that part of the reason that I think it was so well accepted was because so many people knew so much about it so quickly because they leaned into spreading it. They would rather people know about it in advance and have an opinion than try to wait and figure out how many record sales they could produce just by doing the usual marketing template. And I think that's a really important way to look at and understand how people were able to be so divisive at the time, like you've talked about. Like, it's looking back on it now, you would think that everyone unanimously agreed that it was a great record. But what people seem to agree on now is we see that this was an important turning point in music history, and we mostly all agree to that. But going back, a lot of people, a fair amount of people
We're
said,
like, hell no.
Yeah, this is ambient, aimless garbage. This is kids doing electronica for the first time.
I look at a lot of that stuff as them stress testing the system, especially when you think of it in the context of, like, they went a couple of different places to try to write and record and had a couple of sessions that went nowhere. And so there seemed to be a general sense of maybe impending doom in the band. Like, okay, if this is it, so what? We just put out a huge record that won a Grammy and sold a bazillion copies and whatever. The thing about all of that was the most interesting to me was they played Glastonbury. They played this huge show. It didn't go well. It was rife with technical difficulties. They played what they thought was poorly in front of an enormous audience, right? And in spite of that, the machine kept them locked into another 18 months of touring after that. You have a serious I want to quit moment, and the system won't even let you do that, So it's like, what is the point? If the worst thing that happens is we implode after this, fine. I've been dead for a year and a half already. You know what I mean? So I love the sort of gleeful nihilism, or maybe not even gleeful, just like, well, if something cool happens and we get inspired again, great. And if not, okay, we're done. I'm tired. So there's something really pure and special about all that to me, just seeing what happens.
I think it is pure and special. And that's a great way to describe going back and looking at how people described this record when it came out. Because I want to kind of go back and underline this point about the amount of trust and weight that people had for whatever Radiohead was going to throw at them. Radiohead had true believers. Fans were willing to take whatever was coming out of Thom Yorke and everyone else. And I mean, obviously, from how often they were described as defining a genre that they definitely did not define, all the way into the way that the music on Kid A itself was described. I want to tie that back and underline that idea of this is really about building communities that want to feel a way collectively about a thing. And it's tied so much to that live experience. And I was able, when I took that perspective and then went back and looked at reviews with that lens, it was really easy to draw out where that was coming from. So even if, here I am saying that people walked into Kid A with a lot of confirmation bias, surely I can have the same thing be happening to me here, but it at least presents a new way to see some of these reviews. So for instance, take the Pitchfork review at the time. So not one that's 20 years later in a collector's edition, but really at the time, there are a few parts of this that were really interesting to draw out. So one of the quotes talked about Thom Yorke singing Black-Eyed Angel swam at me, and there was nothing to fear, nothing to hide. Let's stop for a second. We've already mentioned, and we can talk about a little more, literally the lyrics on this record
mean nothing.
They're random. They were weird, random phrases collected as fragments and quite literally, apparently, put into a hat and drawn to back out in no real defined order, telling no story, making no points. And yet, again, so in this review, the reviewer is talking about hearing this coming out of Thom Yorke live, and he says, the trained and critical part of me marked the similarity to Coltrane's Ole. The human part of me wept in awe. Hearing people say, like, my brain is telling me not only do these words sound really weird, but this sounds exactly like another song to me, and I immediately know it the first time I hear it, and yet there's some other opposite inside of me that thinks it's beautiful. And like other quotes throughout this, right, he talks about comparing Kid A to other albums is like comparing an aquarium to blue construction paper. It's an album of sparkling paradox. It's cacophonous, yet tranquil, experimental, yet familiar, blah, 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 infinite, yet 48 minutes. These are these are ridiculous sentence fragments. But like, and so from an objective standpoint, like we could just as easily say, like, the human part of you is enveloped in a live moment. And that's what happens when you really love something and you feel connected to what's happening around you. You don't feel like you can compare this album to other ones, probably because you haven't heard the ones that sound like this. You're creating these paradoxes to explain something because something new has happened to you. And it's hard for you to understand that in this album, they go from like meandering ambience to national anthem, which feels like a song that belongs on a totally different record. And there are great moments on this album, but like you could just as easily say there are only a few great moments on this album.
That's right.
And so that's not to say that that's my perspective, but I think it is to say, again, that like so much of what's wrapped up in this record comes from the way that they were able to amplify this singular moment in the year 2000 and have so many people say, I trust you, Radiohead, and you've delivered on this thing for me. And because there's such a space and a contrast between what I expected and what I got, it feels like novelty, which aligns with what Thom Yorke was trying to do himself in the studio by throwing out guitars, by choosing to basically build instruments out of electronic parts and create sounds that way. He wanted novelty. He talked about how Tom Waits as a songwriter, kept himself going by trying to be completely ignorant of the instruments he was using. And I'm not going to go on and say Tom York is Tom Waits, because I'm not ready for that, and I don't think that that's true anyway.
You're not ready for me to leap over this table at you either.
But I can appreciate the fact that he so deeply was able to invest himself in that concept that then his audience was able to feel that novelty too. And I think that is what's amazing about Kid A, much more so than the individual songs that were written, is that he was able to translate. And I say he, I know that this is a whole band, but we have so much to learn from Tom York in this, and he talks so much about his angle, and he did seem to be the catalyst of this change.
He challenged the rest of the band when they didn't seem to want to be. Like, this was a 3-guitar band, and they were like, what's the place for me if we're only playing like weird doodads the whole time? And they kind of had to like relearn what to do with their hands, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, I mean, they had some of the guitarists started, I mean, not only playing other instruments, but then trying to make their guitars sound like synthesizers. That became its own interesting loop, because then when they went back to playing live, they would often play, real, regular instruments to reproduce the record, which I think is, again, another amazing thing about Radiohead that kind of feeds back into this whole cycle. And I think another aspect of it that helps triangulate what was going on in Kid A, well, a couple of different aspects. One of them is, like we mentioned earlier, Amnesiac, which was released the next year, was recorded essentially at the same time. These are recorded in the same sessions, with the exception of Life in a Glass House. I want to be objectively true at all points in this podcast, because if I get one message from somebody that's like, Wikipedia, bro, I can't. And so Amnesiac was released the following year, and it has a very different feel. It's looser, it's jazzier, and it feels a little bit more like you're sitting in a studio with Radiohead listening to them work through things. And I think that there's just as much about this record on that record. Like, whatever ended up in Amnesiac tells you what Radiohead didn't want you to hear during Kid A.
Well, and that whole thing came out with In Rainbows, the 0110 thing, where you could sequence the songs of OK Computer and In Rainbows, and that was sort of intentional with a 10-second crossfade, like that syncing up Dark Side of the Moon with the Wizard of Oz level of shit, where you're like, is there any way they could have known, or did it just happen this way? It's interesting to kind of play the same game. So trying to figure out what this record meant or didn't mean, the most helpful part of the exercise for me was couching it against OK Computer and then against Amnesiac. Two very different but equally important exercises. And you think about what would have been different if you'd swapped out a handful of songs. So like the way both records kind of have an interesting denouement, motion picture soundtrack on Kid A versus Life in a Glass House at the end of Amnesiac. How would that have made the record feel different? Hunting Bears on Amnesiac sounding like a weird, like Dylan Carlson. Like, if I'm going to pick back up the guitar, okay, has it been enough time? Is it safe to do that again? I'm going to only make it really textural and pastoral and old westy. The only one that I thought would really fit on Kid A was the Revolving Door song. There's something about that, the tension in that seemed to really fit. But that's an exercise I would encourage all of you to do, is to put both albums in a playlist if you haven't already, and just kind of play them on shuffle. Because there's something really interesting about that headspace, in the same way that I think like some of those reissues of older records try to achieve with like hearing a bunch of alternate takes of Coltrane songs or something like that, where you just kind of take in the headspace in the studio at that time as a whole, and it gives you a bigger, fuller moment. But I didn't really start appreciating Kid A until I did a few days of looping OK Computer and Kid A back to back. And I thought I really liked OK Computer a lot when I was younger. And I don't really like OK Computer anymore, because it feels like it doesn't have enough spice in it. Now it's like too rocky, too hokey. And I know we have the 22 years or whatever where people have like shamelessly ripped it again and again, and every flavor of indie has some take on a Radiohead song. But like OK Computer is too guitar-y. I can see where you would get sick to death of playing those songs every day for 2 years. And I would want to completely abandon it too. I just think there's, again, an objectively good record. I think it's really interesting. The most interesting moments on OK Computer are the ones where they start to go the farthest out because it's a lot more templated. But by the same token, I think the Kid A moments, Kid A is known for going really far out. And I think the inverse has become true for me, like the stuff that gets closer to the middle, like Optimistic, even the Optimistic in Limbo combo, where it's like a little closer back to the rock center, is like some of the best Radiohead all time. When people talk about this record, they talk about the everything in its right place. They talk about how to disappear completely. They talk about Idiotech, which is, probably one of the all-time great songs of this era, period. But Kid A is mostly great to me because it doesn't have any of the like bright, shiny, shimmery art school Beatles bullshit like Let Down or Electioneering from OK Computer. And so I appreciate that about it. So Kid A is almost one of those things that like people talk about not taking it at the song level, taking it at the full 48-minute level. I feel like you have to go even bigger in the body of Radiohead to even get there. There's a Guitar Moves Matt Sweeney interview with Josh Homme from Queens, and he talked about soloing like Jimi Hendrix. And there's this one bend that Hendrix did, and he was like, you almost have to play the notes around it to get to that bend. And like Radiohead's whole arc to me is like that. Like Kid A is that one weird Hendrix bend, and you gotta listen to the records around it to be like, oh, that's okay, I get it now. This is why. Yep. Because if you weren't there for that one really specific moment, it feels like you'd miss it, and you'd just be like, oh, okay, this is awe-techer. Fine, cool, great, got it, check.
I fully agree. But I know we try to steer away from like, we listened to this album and these are our favorite tracks off of them. This one's good. This one's not. But
it's important here because it's a little whiplashy, you know, like some of the stuff is really different from some of the other stuff.
And I can, again, with all of the context we've given, I can understand why people would be most excited about the ones that went really far out because of how much contrast they created. But to me, songs like National Anthem
with
are
the
just
benefit of the hindsight.
Yeah. And like, so like National Anthem feels like it screams from backstage somewhere all of a sudden because you've been meandering. And now here comes this track that's actually catchy, that has a great line, a good intro. Naturally, it was written before this, recorded, intended to be an OK Computer B-side. I'm really glad it ended up on this record.
Yeah, me too.
And
it would have been a totally different record without this song.
Right. And then to really start hearing the I Love Charles Mingus just worship in the horns is really good. To start like, okay, so it's not just ambient and electronica that we're seeing here. There are other inspirations that are creeping in, no pun intended.
And some of the reviews called it an art rock cliche to do the saxophone, the like sort of jazz introduction freak out. It's like, sure, maybe the idea of it, but it was executed so perfectly. It feels like Radiohead, but the mix of everything is inverted because the guitar and the synth are just kind of there for texturing, and they're way back and out in the mix, and the saxophone plays that role. But man, that is a perfect bass line. Just everything about that shit is so perfectly executed. And if you take nothing else away, I think that's just like put that song on a playlist and let it rip because it still is so good.
The other one that deserves everything, all the credit it's gotten, if not way more, to me is motion picture soundtrack.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe one of the absolute best ambient and orchestral songs. It made a lot more sense coming back to the Sigur Rós thing. To me, that song in Sigur Rós is like, that is the actual connection point. That's the most ambient, and there are so few words to describe Sigur Rós that it becomes like difficult to compare them, right? But the same way that they are theatrical in a serious way that really envelops you, and like, I go to a Sigur Rós show and I'm like, I have heard whatever this chord is a million times from a million other bands, but this one makes me cry and I don't know why. And I'm enveloped in however we got here and whatever you did to build me up to this moment and creating an apex that's just usually just a basic major chord progression, but the buildup has been so dramatic that it feels like you've arrived somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And motion picture soundtrack feels that way to me. That's another one worth bringing out and taking out of the context of the record to me, because it is standalone one of the best songs from that era period, in my opinion.
I think he crazy. Maybe I think he crazy.
And I loved going back and hearing both of these kind of, and allowing myself to take them out of the context of the album. Because usually you and I are the people that are like, always listen to the album
That's right.
in its entirety. And in this one, it's almost like that angle's sort of been beat to death, actually.
Yeah.
Can we take the things back out and figure out what the touch points are?
Yeah, that article that you mentioned where the guy said motion picture soundtrack made him cry is Mark Beaumont from The Guardian. And that was like my standout review in all of this, where he was like, one of those things that music critics love to do is take the piss on the things that they wrote about an album, like their hottest takes from 10 years ago. Like, how do I feel about this now? How does this hold up? And he was like, everybody was expecting me. I gave Kid A 1.5 out of 5 because I was like, man, only 3 of these songs are cool. My opinion has only sort of changed. I would give it 2.5 out of 5 now, but motion picture soundtrack still makes me cry. And it's just cool that like, that is what a cool transcendent moment that song is, that it can stand out of a record that you're like not sure that you really like that much. It also reminds me a lot, again, I don't know why I keep drawing these comparisons back to Homogenic, but it reminds me of All Is Full of Love and the way that it resolves on this really bright, beautiful,
Absolutely.
orchestral, like, in spite of it all, here I am, and I still have made the choice to love and to find some beauty in the world. So for two very sort of jaded, challenging artists to both arrive at that same point on these records where they like really struggle evidently and push very far out and still kind of arrive at this place thematically and ideologically is super interesting to me.
So much discussion about this to say at once, yeah, Kid A was overrated.
Yeah.
And Radiohead was underrated. Somehow, like, there's so much baked into this that it's like the cultural layer that sat on top of it, the fan base that was so eager to receive this almost received it so uncritically that it did it a disservice to find the moments that were truly innovative here, because I think objectively we can agree this was really experimental, and not in the cool way.
Yeah.
Like in the like literally like, I hope that we can make music that makes some sense.
Yeah.
And people gave Radiohead so much grace to be able to just come out with it that I don't know that the album itself was looked at critically enough at the time. One of the funniest reviews at the time came from Select, a Britpop magazine, that said, "What do you want for sounding like Aphex Twin circa 1993? A medal?" Like, and so, you know, we talked about that there were people at the time who were like, yeah, hold on. I've been listening to this stuff for a long time. This is like amateur hour versions of the music I already love. But it's such a contradiction, the way that this record came out, the way it was so readily adopted, because at once, yeah, overrated and underrated. Like, the music itself, not always that special, but the way that they presented it to people, the way that people latched onto it, absolutely special. No one else was doing anything like this. There was no amount of dedication that even compared somewhat to the way that a Radiohead fan base was willing to listen to this and then ready to go to a show, to share the music, to tell other people about it, to go buy it the day it came out, to just get all over the internet and waste all of their AOL minutes on everything about this record, keyword Kid A over and over. I just found it so interesting to go back and pick up Kid A and kind of pick it up and inspect it again and hold it up to the light and see so much that was wrapped up in it and be able to dissect it a little bit and figure out, where did all of this mythology come from?
One thing that I have just started thinking about in the past few days as we prepare to have this conversation is I'm not sure how many voices I saw represented from people of color or women. I don't even know if this made a dent in the consciousness of non-white dudes. I say as one straight white dude looking at another straight white dude talking into a microphone. Now that we're in kind of the post-monoculture era, this was maybe one of the first fragments of that, because I don't know that it registered outside of super white as hell world. And I would love to be wrong on that take. I would love to hear from women and people of color specifically about what was your experience with this record? Did it register this seismically with anyone who didn't look like us? So I hope that's part of the social media conversation around this, because I got the creeping sense that this mattered a lot to some people and not at all to others. And you were the one that pointed out to me that this came out exactly 9 months after D'Angelo's Voodoo, which we'll be covering later in the season. Totally different experience. Both were challenging. Both were a left turn for established artists that had kind of captured the collective imagination. Both were still immensely popular in spite of that. Some crossover in the audiences, but I suspect not a lot, even though they were two of the biggest records of that year. So once you pointed that out to me, I started thinking about who specifically are we talking about when we talk about all the everybody who cared about these records and made them platinum?
Yeah, and it's not to say that lessens it. Usually I'm not a white guy culture apologist.
Right.
But, that I don't think you're saying that to say it doesn't deserve to be that important just because it was focused inside of one specific demographic potentially.
That's exactly right.
Right. But yeah, that's picking this thing up and putting it up to the light, being willing to say so many people view Kid A with such reverence that I think one of the things you and I are very aligned on in our whole life is anytime someone has too much reverence for something, it's time to question it.
Yeah, you should definitely light it on fire.
Time to pick it up and figure out what's under there, because there's probably some mold growing at the bottom.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
And so, but this was a worthwhile exercise. And I'll be honest that even though I don't know that it turned me around on how I felt about the musical content of the record, which is, okay, this is good. It's got some good moments. Other moments are fine. I'd rather listen to some other bands who do similar things like this. But I will say the degree to which it held up in terms of what Radiohead was able to accomplish by being willing to invest themselves only and solely in the music and in the moment of what they were creating is a great story. It's a story that rarely happens, especially in the new millennium at all, especially at the turn of the century there. We don't have a lot of people making big artistic moments or big artistic statements like that anymore, which is why I do think that comparison to Pink Floyd is fair enough.
Yeah, Time called this the weirdest album ever to go platinum or something like that, which I immediately Googled and was like, that can't be true. But I can't think of really any other analogs. Dark Side of the Moon's not a good one at all. That one's way more accessible than this record. I can't think of another moment where something was this intentionally challenging and kind of permeated the cosmic consciousness as much as it did.
And to that end, credit where credit's due.
For sure.
If it is the weirdest album to ever go platinum, that kind of seems like what they were trying to accomplish.
And that's a very cool thing. Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.